Okay. In my previous video, which I would call a stream of consciousness journal entry, as it was very cathartic and therapeutic to finally get all of that out of my brain and into the void in the form of sound waves. And by the way, this time around I have a script, written by me, of course, no AI slop here. I have a script because, with all the bookmarks that I have, I could easily ramble off the cuff on the topic of this video for 24 hours straight. But I'm content with that rambling 2-hour journal entry that was my previous video. If I were to record it again, I would change only one thing: stop using sociopath and psychopath interchangeably. While neither word is an official classification in modern psychiatry and clinical psychology, the general consensus is that a sociopath is emotional and fearful, while a psychopath is cold-blooded, emotionless, and fearless. For me, there are very few psychopaths, very few. The kind that are about to be eaten alive feet first by pigs like Hannibal Lecter and feel absolutely zero fear and emotion. In fact, there are none that I know of or have read about. None. Subhumans are all greedy, estrogenic, cowardly sociopaths, not psychopaths. With that little rectification out of the way, I'll continue. In my previous video, or journal entry, I stated that psychopathic Mother Nature hates a coward, and I explained the evolutionary mechanism of neurochemical reward and punishment based on serotonin. For anyone who didn't listen to the 2-hour ramble, to summarize, nature punishes males that get dominated, especially dominated without fighting back, by depleting their serotonin, and rewards dominant males by increasing their serotonin. Lower serotonin levels correlate with anxiety, lack of confidence, emotional fragility, and either extreme submissiveness or extreme impulsive aggression. For example, being prone to chimping out. Meanwhile, higher serotonin levels can promote calm, confident, socially competent behavior that helps attain and maintain higher rank and access to females. If we look at primates, then the lower a primate's rank in the troop, and troop is the word primatologists use for a community of primates, the lower his serotonin. The higher his rank, the higher his serotonin. That's a broad statistical tendency according to scientific research, because of course it's not always that black and white. A quick example: a high-ranking chimp can be, and usually is, stressed and paranoid about other chimps attacking him to take his place. And stress and paranoia can certainly deplete serotonin. So there are benefits to being high-ranking, neurochemical benefits, but also disadvantages. Fascinatingly enough, nobody talks about this, at least not in the mainstream. Cortisol is a hot mainstream topic, and so is serotonin, but in the context of depression, not in the context of rank and domination. And serotonin has serious, long-lasting neuroplastic effects. Jordan Peterson touched on it briefly in his trademark lobster example, which outlines dominance hierarchies, defeat, victory, and serotonergic neuroplasticity. But there he was strictly focusing on clear acts of domination, that is to say, combat. And it seemed perfectly evident, it seemed elementary, that a male that wins a battle feels better mentally, and a male that loses feels worse. But I've never heard anyone make the link between disrespect and domination. I had to arrive at that by myself. But it all makes sense. Every act of disrespect, no matter how small, is an act of domination. The male who is trying to disrespect you is essentially trying to dominate you, whether consciously or subconsciously. You can call it micro-domination if it's something small, but it's still domination, or at least an attempt at domination, because how your brain perceives that attempt at domination largely depends on how much serotonin you have accumulated throughout your life up until that point. For example, prisoners have draconian, self-made prison rules, and they're hyper-vigilant to disrespect, that is, domination, or, as they say, getting punked. And their egos are exceptionally fragile, and they are exceptionally prone to chimping out because they are completely serotonin depleted. Genetics, of course, plays a role as well: intelligence, inhibition levels, testosterone levels, etc. But the importance of serotonin levels can't be understated. Prisoners are the dregs of society. You can't get any lower in the modern day Western dominance hierarchy than a prisoner that has to sleep in a cage next to a toilet, surrounded by violent sub 80 IQ dregs, and he can only eat, watch TV, or walk outside when other males, and even females, that is, prison guards, allow him to do so. Furthermore, most prisoners were already completely serotonin depleted before they became criminals and then convicts. They're the so-called Negro sons of crackhead single mothers and the descendants of cucked males that lived as slaves for 350 years, stripped of culture and identity with the Anglo-Saxon surnames of the owners of their ancestors and speaking the language of the owners of their ancestors. They're the Latino sons of illegal immigrant single mothers, a cucked mongrel race speaking not just one but two languages of their conquerors and colonizers, Spanish and English. They're the white sons of trailer park trash, crackhead, alcoholic, chain-smoking single mothers that had a never-ending revolving door of alcoholic bums, filling them up and abusing the sons, verbally, physically, and even sexually. So serotonin obliteration across the board, due to every kind of trauma and determinism there is. Genetic, social, economic, and what I call ethnic determinism, meaning where your ethnicity ranks, both historically and presently, in the global dominance hierarchy, or the global not getting cucked hierarchy, since fundamentally, atavistically, domination is all about cucking and not getting cucked. The lower the rank, the more your serotonin will be depleted throughout your life due to this form of determinism, that is, ethno-determinism, if you can't break free of the subhuman ethno-nationalist collectivist mindset. And the higher the rank, the higher the ethnic neurochemical privilege, either consciously or subconsciously, with the highest rank arguably belonging to the Anglo-Saxons, who dominated and cucked almost the whole world, whose language we're all speaking, and who have that dominant Northern European Germanic aesthetic that large swaths of the world are obsessed with, like, for example, Nigeria, where up to 77% of females practice skin bleaching, even more than in India where it's 60%, or Thailand where it's 70%. Or, listen to this, in Scandinavia, where they already have that prized Germanic aesthetic, and they pretend to be so egalitarian and tolerant and race-blind. But that's just pretending, of course, because they're extremely obsessed with looking as Germanic as possible, as evidenced by the statistic that up to 96% of females dye their hair to keep it as blonde as possible. But returning to the prisoners, to top it off, most violent criminals serving 20-plus year sentences are not just lowly dregs, but also cowards, because they didn't fight to the death when the police were putting hands on them to lock them up in cages as modern-day slaves for the rest of their lives. They were such strong, brave, quote-unquote alpha bullies when it came to committing violent crimes. But then they quickly became weak, fearful, beta cowards when the police pulled up, put hands on them, physically dominated them, put them in chains, i.e. in handcuffs, and threw them in a cage. What happened? I thought you were such alpha warriors, such alpha psychos, Disgusting larpers. And that ties into the main topic of this video. Psychopathic Mother Nature hates a coward and tries to neurochemically punish males that don't play her chimp games, yes. But after studying history and psychology for the last 2 years, I realized something that I've never seen anyone else realize or talk about. In fact, the opposite is argued and accepted. That if we're here, it means our ancestors were the strongest and bravest of all the rest. No. Our ancestors were cowards, tappers, tap, 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 slaves, cucks, males that surrendered instead of fighting to the death. And if I'm to drag females into this, then we're all descendants of females that prefer to get raped by invaders instead of killing themselves. Like the estimated 2 million Nazi German females, arguably collectively the proudest and most arrogant and most racist females in history. Yet they prefer to get gang raped by the intermentioned Slavic Mongoloid hordes instead of dying with dignity and killing themselves. Extremely few killed themselves, and most of those that actually did so after they had already been gang raped. They gave birth to at least 200,000 mongrel Mongoloid babies after that mass rape. 200,000 Mongoloid bastards that were raised by the cucked and dominated surviving Übermenschen German males and taxpayers. So if we're all descendants of cowards, which we are, every last one of us, then does nature really hate a coward? She absolutely does. And that's why the neurochemical punishment and reward mechanism is there, to create a dominance hierarchy and makes chimps of us all. But there seems to be one thing nature hates more than a coward, And that's a human, a man, not a male. And what do I mean by that exactly? A human, a real human, in addition to self-awareness, has something truly unique, truly human, a self-destructive sense of dignity, honor, self-respect. No other animal possesses that. Animals instinctively possess a sense of dignity, yes, if dignity is viewed as serotonin, and they try to guard their dignity/serotonin, but not self-destructively. I argued in an old video that animals fight to the death to coom, not to procreate, and I was wrong. Not about the cooming part, but about the fighting to the death part. No animal goes into a fight knowing that it will die, or instinctively expecting to die. And an animal will choose to run away or submit if the enemy is much bigger. Natural selection favors behaviors that maximize reproductive success, not heroic self-sacrifice. And lastly, there is no evidence that any animal ever knowingly takes its own life under any circumstances, let alone in the name of dignity. And that is what separates humans, not subhumans, but humans, from animals. And how does that self-destructive human sense of dignity, honor, and self-respect manifest itself? By refusing to bend the knee, to kneel, to prostrate yourself in exchange for titles, rank, materialism, validation, desperate hope of an afterlife, refusing to surrender and beg for mercy when given the chance. And I say when given the chance because fighting and dying and fighting to a certain death are two completely different things. So refusing to surrender when given the chance to become just a lowly slave that can be abused, dehumanized, and humiliated in any way his master or masters wish, just because he's so terrified of death. A human guards his dignity and honor, in other words, his serotonin, above all, and will fight to the death or kill himself, instead of surrendering to become a subhuman slave and have his serotonin absolutely raped. Psychopathic Mother Nature hates a human much more than she hates a coward, because she ultimately has very little control over a human. If everybody behaved as a human and not as a coward, the species would have gone extinct a long time ago. The strength of subhumanity is solely in numbers, cooperation, and hierarchical subjugation. We weren't designed to fight to the death. We were designed to first resist, but ultimately to submit, and be a good cog in the machine, that is, in the community. Chimps and bonobos are the closest primates to subhumans in behavior, and observe how they live, in large communities, with dominant males monopolizing the females, and subservient males serving the community like lowly slaves in exchange for grooming. And grooming is extremely important for chimps because they're not as flexible as the solitary orangutan and need other chimps to take care of their hygiene, parasites, and lice. So they're serving the community like lowly slaves in exchange for grooming, safety in numbers, and the hope of maybe one day being able to sneak fuck one of the females. If they had any self-destructive sense of dignity, a cucked beta male would say fuck this shit and either charge the alpha males in a life and death battle or simply leave the troop, knowing full well that he won't last long due to parasites or predators or both, but it's better to live on your feet than die cucked on your knees. Likewise, the alpha males are just temporarily alpha, and when it would come time for them to get replaced by stronger males, they would also either fight to the death or simply leave, instead of being relegated to cucked beta male status. But then the species would promptly go extinct. Chimps were not designed to have a self-destructive sense of dignity, and neither were subhumans, whose strength and survival is only in numbers, as they are significantly weaker than chimps, and their females are the weakest, most frail, most helplessly dependent of all females in the mammalian animal kingdom. And that is why nature hates a coward, but she also loves a coward. She selects for survival, not honor. Death before dishonor sounds and looks beautiful and plentiful on the big screen, but reality is very different. And yes, the mainstream historical narrative could be fiction as well, but it unquestionably presents the reality of the human condition, that is to say, the subhuman condition, far more accurately than any fiction on the big screen. And that reality is that the Spartacus slave rebellion was crushed in the end, and the irony is that instead of fighting to the death in the final battle, thousands chose to surrender and become slaves again, only to be dehumanized, humiliated, tortured, and crucified. 6,000 slaves, not rebels, but slaves. They had the chance to die as brave rebels, warriors, humans, but the prospect of certain death was so terrifying that they froze and surrendered, and died as cowardly slaves, crucified along the Appian Way with their bodies stretching 200 kilometers, carrion for vultures. That reality is that 20,000 Ottomans were so petrified of fighting to the death or killing themselves and dying with dignity that they preferred to surrender to Vlad the Impaler like cowards and suffer a horrific, miserable subhuman death. That is, getting very slowly impaled through the ass and creating the infamous Forest of the Impaled. That reality is that after Haitians won their revolution against the French and slavery, they were almost all essentially re-enslaved in an extremely harsh forced labor system called corvée by their own new self-styled nobility, who were all lowly slaves just a decade earlier, and who started building European-style palaces all over the island and exploiting the now so-called free Haitians, just like the French did before them. To say nothing of the huge debt that they were forced to pay at gunpoint to the French nation in 1825, a debt for which they were forced to take out a high-interest loan from Rothschild banks, and which took them 120 years to fully pay off. That reality is that the Gaulish noble warrior king Vercingetorix and his tens of thousands of Gaulish warriors surrendered at the siege of Alesia to the Romans and became cowardly subhuman slaves instead of fighting to the death. In total, up to 1 million Gauls were enslaved by the Romans. So first, the Celtic Gauls tapped to the Romans. Then, the Gallo-Romans tapped to the Germanic Franks and Normans, and Gaul became France, or Land of the Franks. Likewise, the English, unquestionably the most dominant ethnicity on the planet. But the English are called the Anglo-Saxons, because the Germanic Angles and Saxons dominated and cucked the indigenous Celtic Britons, who tapped not only to the Germanic invaders, but to the Roman invaders before them. And modern-day English have up to 60% Celtic Briton blood in them. And before all of that, the Neolithic Europeans got dominated and cucked and tapped to the Y chromosome of the invading Yamnaya males from the Pontic Caspian steppe over 5,000 years ago, just like any other peoples who started speaking an Indo-European language, from Europe all the way to present-day India, as the Yamnaya were the progenitors of all Indo-European languages. Although, to be precise, it was the Santashta males, descendants of the Yamnaya and the inventors of the war chariot, who migrated out of the Eurasian steppe eastward and went on to dominate Iran and northern India. Human history, that is to say, subhuman history, is a history of tappers, slaves, servants, those who beg and bow and scrape, if not for their lives, then for title and rank and materialism. If every male and female in history behaved like the 960 Jewish men, women, and children who killed themselves at the desert fortress of Masada in 72 CE, instead of surrendering and being taken as slaves and completely dehumanized by the Romans, just because they were cowards so terrified of death and so desperate to live another day even as abject dogs in chains, if every male behaved like those Jews at Masada, or the 300 Spartans, or the sacred band of Thebes, or Cleopatra and Mark Antony who killed themselves instead of surrendering to Augustus, or the shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru, who chose to commit seppuku instead of surrendering when he was surrounded by his enemies. Out of the 60-plus shoguns in history, he was the only one that died a true samurai's honorable death. If every male behaved like that, like a human, either throughout his life, or at least when faced with a slavery or death scenario, then there would be no surrender, no slave labor, no serfdom, no cannon fodder, no intrasexual hierarchy, no beggars, no bowing and scraping, no civilization, no community, no species. Feeble subhumans were designed to survive as communal, collectivist cogs, not independent, individualist gorillas or orangutans. And that is why, as much as psychopathic Mother Nature hates a coward, at the same time, she makes cowards of us all. All the so-called noble and elite males you see today, they're all weak, fearful, privileged, cowardly bullies. and they'd all be picking cotton just the same if someone, quote unquote, more powerful came along. In fact, I give them far too much credit with the thumbnail to this video. They're far too lowly and pathetic and greedy and cucked and subhuman to be picking cotton out in the field. Picking cotton was for the field Negro who refused to kiss Mass's ass, but was too afraid to die fighting. He was still a coward, yes, but far less of a despicable coward than the house Negro. So almost all the so-called elites today, they're already house Negroes, because unless they're at the very top of the hierarchy, a position which is reserved for a select few families, they're kissing ass and bowing and scraping all the time. And even those at the very top are bowing and scraping before some 25-year-old discarded used condoms. But that's a different intersexual story. The focus here is intrasexual dynamics. So keep that in mind, because nobody does. Subhumanity is ruled by greedy, sociopathic, privileged, cowardly bullies, LARPing as descendants of some honorable, noble warrior race that never actually existed. Stop the LARP. You're not a cold, fearless psychopath. You're not an alpha male. You're not a warrior. You're not a ruler. You're not a descendant of brave warriors that never bent the knee to any male, whether foreign or domestic. You are greedy, emotional, sociopathic, privileged, subhuman cowards, just like your ancestors. And the moment anyone stronger comes along and tells you to kneel or die, you will kneel, just like your ancestors did. And that goes for any male out there who thinks he's tough, thinks he's alpha. Stop the LARP and stop the amogging. But of course they can't stop the LARP. They can't stop the amogging because they're not humans, but subhumans, animal automatons, mere puppets on psychopathic Mother Nature's evolutionary neurochemical strings. Any male that ever tries to disrespect you in any way for whatever reason, just keep in mind, besides being gynocentric, discarded used condom whipped, cum particle inhaling cuckolds, history demonstrates that the overwhelming majority of males, arguably 99.9% or even higher, when faced with the choice between death and surrender, choose surrender. Heroic last stands are remembered precisely because they're extraordinarily rare. For every Masada, there are countless Alicias. So just keep in mind, there's a 99.9% chance that that chimp trying to disrespect you would surrender like a subhuman coward, just like all the rest of them, beg for mercy, and live on his knees kissing Massa's feet and squealing like a pig.
Boy. I bet you can squeal. I bet you can squeal like a pig. We'll squeal. Squeal now. Squeal. Squeal. Squeal louder. 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 Get down there, boy. Louder. Hey, them bridges down. Yes, sir. You can get better than that, boy. You can get better than that. Come on, squeal. Squeal.